simple, this 2020 election was a mess. We have one group of individuals saying that there was fraud that took place, another group saying there is no evidence of fraud taking place, one group by the name of fact checkers dismissing any evidence of fraud, and one group saying that there isn't any fraud because there is no evidence of fraud despite any attempt to prove fraud has been censored or fact checked. Voter fraud and the fear of voter fraud is nothing new. Some claim that claiming there might be voter fraud is a scare tactic to discourage voters from voting and therefore causes voters to be disenfranchised or a victim of voter suppression. To keep the fear and threat of voter fraud from the integrity of our elections, many have suggested the use of identification cards at the voting booth. Some claim that asking for an identification card before voting will suppress some voters. But how could asking for ID suppress voters? Some suggest that requiring voter ID makes it harder for minorities to cast their ballot. Others on the internet have claimed it's racist to require an ID. Personally, our team at That One Media finds it actually racist to assume that minorities do not have the proper identification or access to it. But is voter ID harmful for the voter? Voter ID would allow for the comfort of the government and the voter that the vote counted is real if an ID is required to vote, and that there won't be any need to assume that any of the votes that are cast are not valid due to the person not being who they say they are. Currently, 36 out of 50 states require some form of identification. Some states require a government-issued ID, whereas other states require some form of identification to prove that you are who you say you are or you live where you say you live. This can be in the form of a utility bill or a bank statement. The states that strictly require a government-issued ID are Wisconsin, Indiana, Kansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia. The states where a photo ID is requested are Idaho, South Dakota, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Michigan, Alaska, Florida, South Carolina, and Rhode Island. States where ID is requested but no photo is required are New Hampshire, Connecticut, Delaware, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Utah, Colorado, Montana, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii. States where no document is needed to vote are Oregon, California, Nevada, Wyoming, New Mexico, Nebraska, Minnesota, Illinois, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Montana, DC, Maryland, Vermont, and Maine. In the states that either have a strict or non-strict ID requirement have some leeway when it comes to voting. If the voter is unable to present an ID on the day of voting, they can still vote on a provisional ballot that day, and then they are given a time frame to come back and present an ID. Each state has their own rules as to what is counted as a valid form of identification, if it is required. However, having an identification card and the requirement to have it when voting does not disenfranchise the voter. There are many things that require you to have an ID. You need an ID to fly, to buy alcohol, to gamble, to open a bank account, to buy cigarettes, to apply for food stamps, Medicare, Social Security, welfare, etc., apply for a job, to buy or rent a home, get a hotel room, pick up a prescription, and purchase some over-the-counter cold medicines, and the list goes on and on. Asking for an ID in those circumstances are not looked at negatively, but asking for an ID when voting is considered voter suppression and disenfranchising of the voter. Come on, man. Some still claim that the requirement to have an ID does not decrease voter fraud, if there is any that took place. But removing the variable of not being who they say they are allows for the focus of voter fraud to be based on other factors that takes impersonation out of the equation. If IDs were required in states like Pennsylvania, a state that is often accused of voter fraud, the statement or claim that there are people voting that are dead or alive in the election within the state of Pennsylvania would be thrown out the window even before it leaves the person's mouth. There is no negative to requiring an ID to vote. The only group that will find this negative are those who abuse the non-required ID laws to interfere in our elections.